Ladies and gentlemen, it's 12 o'clock, and I think we're going to start promptly. Are we okay in the tech room? Are we online? All good. Excellent. Okay. So welcome, fellows and guests, both in person and online. My name is Simon Gilmore, and I'm the director of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. It's great to be here to kick off this joint event with our sister learned society in Scotland. And I just want to provide a very short introduction to you all about the Society of Antiquaries. Both societies received their royal charters from the King in 1783. The Antiquarian Charter states our objective to investigate both antiquities and natural and civil history in general, with the intention that the talents of humanity should be cultivated and the study of natural and useful sciences should be promoted. Not the useless sciences. The RSE Charter created a society which should consider not only the sciences of mathematics, physics, chemistry, medicine and natural history, but also those which relate to archaeology, philology and literature. Since our foundation, we've worked together and indeed shared these premises in the past. And this is simply our most recent collaboration, and it certainly will not be our last. We are both membership organisations, and I will now make the plea for anyone who is here who is not a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland to consider joining us. There are many benefits to becoming an antiquary. The Society publishes books, it produces an annual journal of history and archaeology, it advocates on behalf of Scottish heritage, it also holds events like this, obviously, as well, and lectures, and we run national projects for the public benefit. Anyone who has an interest in Scotland's past can join the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. In essence, we welcome anyone who shares our values and our vision that Scotland's past is for everyone to research, share, enjoy, and protect wherever they are. We have a subscription category that to suit any circumstance, and when you become a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, you get no less than 3 more letters after your name than you do if you're a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And we're also cheaper. So on that bombshell, I will invite Professor Thompson from the RSE to introduce the event today. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, Simon. Thank you for that delightful introduction, and a warm welcome to you all in the room at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and also to those of you joining us either online or on YouTube. We're delighted to have you join us for this special event. I'm Des Thompson, a Fellow of the RSE and Leverhulme Emeritus Fellow at the University of the Highlands and Islands. I should start with just a little bit of housekeeping. Please note that the RSE's fire safety and evacuation procedure is to assemble outside the dome, leaving the building the way you came in. And in the lecture theatre, the fire exit routes are on the current slide here, but please follow RSE staff's instructions in the case of an evacuation, and they're up at the back and we'll follow them. But we're not expecting an alarm today, but if it does go off, just head for the back. Now, this is a special occasion, also marking the publication next month of the book Harvie's Dyke about transformational events and people in Scotland. And the event, as Simon has kindly said, is hosted jointly by the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. For those of you not familiar with these two societies, and we've heard a bit about the latter, I can tell you that the RSE is Scotland's national academy. Its fellowship of 1,800 people is drawn from the most distinguished in their fields of academia, business and the public sector. And the Society provides independent expert advice to government and policymakers and seeks to inspire the next generation of innovative thinkers. Formed in 1783 for the advancement of learning and useful knowledge, over the ensuing 242 years, the RSE has sought to contribute actively to the social, economic and environmental well-being of Scotland. Now, I did a little bit of research on the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and I see it's 3 years older than the Royal Society of Edinburgh and has 800 more fellows, and hopefully there will be even more fellows following today. Founded by the redoubtable 11th Earl of Buchan, and he's someone who's well worth reading about, founded in 1780, the Society supports research and innovation into Scotland's past, advocating as an independent voice for heritage and sharing knowledge with everyone. And as you said, Simon, for 13 years, the two societies shared the same premises just down the road. So it's excellent that we have this joint event today, and I'm just so delighted we've got members of the fellowship and the executive of both societies here. Now, turning to our guest speaker, we have Professor Chris Whatley, fellow of both societies, I'm pleased to say, and a distinguished historian. Chris is Emeritus Professor of Scottish History at the University of Dundee. Initially a historian of the coal and salt industries and of Scottish industrialisation, Chris has more recently written on a wide variety of Scotland's everyday life: urban society, popular protest, riot and disorder, the causes and consequences of the Union of 1707, memorialisation, and Scottish writers, including Robert Burns and his legacy, and John Galt, the Irvine-born Scottish writer who now compares very favourably with his contemporary Sir Walter Scott. I first met Chris when we planned the RSE's Islands Past, Present and Future series, which ran over the last 2 years, and we've since enjoyed musing on various political and Scottish matters. And in 2019, Chris published Pabe, an island odyssey featuring the tiny diamond-shaped island lying just off Skye's inner sound. It's a marvellous read, with the reviewer in the Herald heaping praise on the book and declaring it scholarly and telling us that Whatley knows his historical onions. So clearly today we're in for a very special talk, if not about vegetables, certainly about important events and people. Now, after the talk, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of Chris and our panel, who we shall introduce after Chris has spoken. We'll not take questions during the talk, so please hang fire for the ensuing question and answer session. But now, without further ado, please welcome Professor Chris Whatley. Chris.
Thanks, Des, you're very kind. This talk, as the title indicates, is about an episode in Scottish history that's been long forgotten, or almost forgotten, because local historians in Glasgow's Parkhead have created a website, which, to their credit, tells part of the story. On YouTube, there's a very interesting short film, Tales of the Riverbank, made by Robert Dawson Scott and Jack Dixon, which references Harvie's Dyke. And there are other bits and pieces out there in the public domain. But you'd struggle to find much, or indeed any, information on the event in Scotland's written history, including that of Glasgow. Nowhere is there any assessment of its significance, and I think it deserves better. So, what am I talking about? Let me begin. It's a nice day, so relax. I'd like to take you back just over 200 years to Saturday the 21st of June, 1823. Midsummer's Day, the longest day of the year. Now imagine you're in Glasgow's East End. Yep. Unlike today's urban sprawl, the eastern outskirts of the ancient borough comprised expanding settlements, hamlets and small villages of mainly working people and primarily handloom weavers who worked in their own homes or in workshops. But with Scotland's industrial revolution gathering pace, some large works had also sprung up, spinning mills, for instance, along with coal mines, dye works, and Colin Dunlop's well-known Clyde ironworks. But even so, there was a rural feel to the area, with most land still being parcelled out in large wooded estates, all with imposing and highly desirable mansion houses owned by some of Glasgow's leading citizens. Now, what you'd have heard had you been in the area on what was a warm, sunny Saturday in June 1823 was the dull tap of a drum being beaten. This would have been easier to hear than usual because most of the works in this part of Glasgow's sprawling barony parish had been shut down a few hours earlier. And workers, if you like, were relieved from their daily toil for the remainder of what would be a weekend unlike any other that they'd ever experienced. The drummer was Thomas Fraser, a handloom weaver aged around 54, who lived with his wife Anne Christie in Brownsland Parkhead. And like most ageing, bent-back weavers, Fraser was less active than he had once been at the loom and had taken on the role of bellman or public crier for the East End villages. So what was Fraser proclaiming? That morning, he'd been given a scrap of paper by an unnamed individual upon which the words of what he was to announce had been written. It was clearly an important announcement because Fraser had been given half a crown for his services, which was considerably more than his usual fee. Now this is the document concerned. The text is scratched in a hesitant hand as if the writer was unfamiliar with using a pen and ink. Fraser's instructions were to request that the inhabitants of Parkhead, Westmuir, Camlachie, Tollcross and adjacent places attend a public meeting at the Cross of Parkhead at 7 o'clock, and there to take into consideration measures for taking away the obstruction on the banks of the Clyde. No one would have known it at the time, but this was the first step in what became a lengthy 6-year campaign over what was known in Glasgow's East End as Harvie's Dyke. Albeit faintly, its repercussions are still with us. Now, the Harvie in question was Thomas Harvie. This is an anti-hero, by the way. From a modest farming background in Yoker to the west of Glasgow, Thomas Harvie in the early 19th century had become one of the city's richest men, mainly owing to the money he'd made, he had amassed anyway from his proprietorship of the immense Glasgow Distillery Company at Port Dundas, which dominated the city's skyline, as you can see there. And from his Glasgow headquarters, Harvie sold whisky throughout the British Isles, while in Glasgow himself he'd established a chain of drinking shops where he'd introduced what were called Harvie's divans, the equivalent of today's lounge bars. Now, ruthless as well as ambitious, Harvie was one of Glasgow's most conspicuous, perhaps colourful characters. Tall, muscular, red-haired, and a flamboyant dresser, in appearance he resembled Beau Brummel. He was a regular attendee at prestigious theatre performances, hunts, and similar events, many of which were patronised by the gentry and nobility of Glasgow and the surrounding counties. Now, the picture here, incidentally, isn't of Harvie, because there isn't one, or not one I've been able to find, but of a figure he might have appeared as, given that he was reputed to buy 2 suits every week. But Lang Tam, as he was nicknamed, yearned to enhance his social status. Like the city's tobacco merchants of the previous century, and along with several other newly rich Glasgow men of business, he was persuaded that the purchase of a landed estate would provide him with the social standing and respect which he so desperately sought. And so, in 1821, he bought Westthorn, a 115-acre coal-bearing property which lay just over 2 miles to the east of the old centre of Glasgow on the main road to Edinburgh. Now, almost immediately, Harvie set about improving his newly acquired property. Not much more than a year later, in 1822, he'd built what was to become the thing with which he was forever to be associated, Harvie's Dyke. This was one of 2 massive walls that marked the western and eastern edges of his estate. The western wall, the Dyke, was a fearsomely imposing structure. No one in Glasgow had seen anything like it before. It stood at least 12 feet high and was between 2 and 3 feet thick. Along with shards of glass, the top edge of the wall was mounted with iron spikes and other flesh-tearing devices that in medieval times had been used to halt horse cavalry charges. But this wasn't all. In order to prevent people wading into the river and skirting round the end of the walls, Harvie had arranged to have cartloads of black broken glass bottles from his drinking shops poured into the river, where the walls ran into the water. He also employed ferocious dogs, which were set loose upon unwary walkers, and Harvie himself carried a pistol, This is a nice, welcoming sort of character. And on the rise above the river, to top it all, he turned a kind of summer house into a watchtower in which he placed small cannons with which to deter would-be passers-by. Now, the impact of these measures was more or less immediately, despite sporadic attempts by local people to sabotage his wall-building operations. Harvie's 2 walls cut across and blocked a pathway along the north bank of the river that had been used from time immemorial. Meandering along the Clyde, as it looped between Rutherglen and Kilmarnock, the path connected Glasgow with villages as far east as Carmyle, which is just off the bottom right-hand corner side of the map. The path, too, was used on an everyday basis by workers as they walked to and from the various mills, factories and mines in the vicinity. But the riverside path served other purposes too. It was a place for recovery once the working day was done. Handloom weavers needed to straighten their backs and move about. Coal miners who'd been underground since dawn wanted to breathe in the open air and enjoy some sunlight, even in Glasgow. While cotton spinners who spent their days in hot, steam-filled mills craved the feel of fresh air on their faces. But Harvie's obstructions, and he wasn't alone, affected not only local people. For thousands of Glaswegians more generally, the River Clyde was, and its banks were special places. The idyllic quality of the banks of the Clyde is captured in these contemporary sketches by Glasgow's leading painter of the time, a guy called John Knox. The riverbank, too, was a popular place for young courting couples who were sort of private space. This was especially at dusk, as that was when they would be out of the sight of the more diligent elders of the kirk. For botanists, it was a veritable paradise, not least for Thomas Hopkirk of Dalbeth Estate, which adjoined Westthorn, who in his Flora Glottiana, published in 1813, identified hundreds of species of flowers and plants that grew on the Clyde's banks, including a couple of species unique to the area around Westthorn. But for working people too, the not only elite who were interested in flowers and herbs and so forth, self-taught self-taught weaver herbalists were in high demand at a time when professional medical care was often out of reach, and they gathered specimens which were used as traditional cures for a range of medicines. The river, too, was of enormous significance. Poems and songs of the period sang its praises. It was even depicted as an element in the borough's inhabitants' DNA, a primeval building block in their identities as proud products of the city of their birth. The song Roll Fair Clutha, which is the Latin name for the Clyde, for example, opened with the lines, "When nature first with mighty hand traced Clyde's fair windings to the main, 'twas then the genii of the land assembled round and sang this refrain. Roll fair Clutha to the sea, and be thy banks forever free. Before continuing, for in thy banks in future times a brave and virtuous race shall rise." In other words, the Clyde was very much a life force, both metaphorically as well as prosaically, a living river, to borrow Robert Macfarlane's terminology. It was an artery through which much of the city's trade flowed, and with that came wealth and employment. Its fish, salmon, were then in abundance, were a source of cheap food, as were oysters. It was also a resort for bathers and swimmers, a playground for rowers, and a workplace for boatmen who made their living by shipping coal down the river for domestic consumers in the city. Yes, there were downsides. Effluent was becoming a problem. There were numerous deaths by accidental drowning. Although, I have to tell you this one, in 1826, one poor woman who for 19 years had contemplated taking her life by throwing herself into the Clyde was hauled out, all the while protesting how dreadful it was that in this boasted land of liberty, a person cannot get drowning herself when she thinks proper. So there we are. But the positives far outweighed any negatives. Consequently, resentment about encroachments of the sort we've noticed at Westthorn was manifest and mounting. Letters warning of what might be lost began to appear in the pages of the Glasgow press. The incursions of landed proprietors such as Thomas Harvie were depicted as attacks not only on the personal liberties of individual citizens, but as being at odds with the rights and privileges of the whole community. So matters came to a head in the spring of 1823. A wooden toll bridge had recently been erected across the Clyde at Dalmarnock, replacing a ford. The ordinary people would now have to pay to cross the river as they travelled back and forth to and from Rutherglen was bad enough. But worse was that it appeared the owner of land beside the bridge was about to build yet another wall across the riverside path. Now, for inhabitants of the villages in the vicinity of Westthorn, Westmuir, Tollcross, Shettleston, Carmyle and Dalmarnock, this was the last straw. For years they'd had to thole and negotiate their way past obstructing walls erected by property-proud landowners. But Harvie's Dyke was the biggest and most disliked of them all, and it had to come down. So at 7 o'clock in the evening on 21st, 1823, as requested by Thomas Fraser, a large crowd gathered at Parkhead Cross. Led by a party of coal miners, the 1,000 or so people who'd assembled marched down to Dalmarnock Bridge, where, as prearranged, they met a similar body of people from Bridgeton before proceeding to Harvie's Dyke. Now, to cut a long and wonderfully colourful story short, gunpowder was then plugged into the west wall, the Dyke, which was blown up and pulled down. The cheering crowd then moved along to the eastern wall and watched as colliers and others hauled it down too. They then began to move towards a third wall further up the river. However, even before the first wall had fallen, Thomas Harvie, terrified and fearing that the crowd would set fire to his house, had rushed to Glasgow. And from there he returned with a sheriff officer and a party of the Enniskillen Dragoons who'd recently arrived in the city. And following some gunfire and a few scuffles, the dragoons scattered the crowd and arrested some 43 individuals. Early on the Sunday morning, they were marched to Glasgow where they were incarcerated in the new jail at the edge of Glasgow Green. Now, there followed in the weeks thereafter a lengthy investigation into the riot, but owing to the near universal refusal of witnesses from the communities concerned to provide enough intimidating evidence, only 4 men were brought before the Circuit Court of Justiciary when it sat in Glasgow in September. There they were found guilty of the wicked, riotous and felonious crimes of mobbing and rioting and other offences, for which they were sent to prison for 6 months. But this was far from the end of the matter. Within days of the levelling of Harvie's walls, 2 critical developments had taken place. First, and believe it or not, as early as Monday 23rd June, hardly 48 hours after the walls had been levelled, Harvie, mightily angered and doggedly determined, had hired masons who began immediately to rebuild the Dyke, this time under armed guard. I don't have a picture of armed guards, but just to remind you what the Dyke looked like. This was in spite of entreaties that he should relent and allow walkers to pass by Westthorn unhindered. Harvie simply refused and declared that he would continue to protect his property rights and privacy, whatever the cost, something that we'll come back to in a minute or two. The second development, as a consequence of Harvie's uncompromising stance, was the inauguration of a campaign to have Harvie's encroachments removed, but this time employing legal means rather than physical force. But going through the courts was an expensive business. Accordingly, what would at times resemble a crusade was set in motion during Glasgow Fair in July. It's difficult in a few moments to describe in full the nature of this remarkable and unprecedented fundraising exercise. Organised under the motto Let Glasgow Flourish, it was led by a combination of some of the city's less opulent merchants and manufacturers, along with members of the local literati. But regardless of their background, what the foremost figures involved all had in common was an attachment to the notion of liberty. Whether as constitutional reformers like Adam Ferry, who was the chairman of the campaign committee, or more radically inclined individuals like Alexander Roger, a weaver poet who'd been deeply implicated in the Radical War of 1820. Now, the campaign team embarked on a host of fundraising activities, and these included appeals to ordinary people for as little as a penny to be put into a box that was placed at Glasgow Cross. Concerts of various kinds were organised, with bands playing especially composed songs such as The Banks of the Clyde, sung to the rousing tune March to the Battlefield, or Roll Fair Clutha, the words of which were set to the heady music of Rule Britannia, thereby making it clear that these were loyal citizens, reformers rather than revolutionaries. Public debates were sponsored by the town's literary forum, the title of one of these being Tam and His Dyke and Broken Bottles. There was an exhibition of the paintings of John Knox, whose romanticised pictures of Glasgow and the Clyde, as shown here, were enormously popular. But every one of these and other events was a success, with subscriptions pouring in as the city united in its determination to defeat Thomas Harvie. It was with this fighting fund that this was to happen, first in the Scottish courts, primarily the Court of Session, and ultimately in 1828 the House of Lords. Now, as far as the law was concerned, the campaigners' task was to prove that for 40 years prior to the spring of 1823, there had been a public footpath along the Clyde from Glasgow Green to Carmyle. Passage along this, they had to demonstrate, had been uninterrupted for the same amount of time. But to do this was an enormously difficult task, as witnesses who could testify to this effect had necessarily to be older, and they also had to be in fit enough condition to give evidence in the Court of Session in Edinburgh. Most had never left their East End villages. And this arduous task of identifying and interviewing witnesses was taken on by the aforesaid Alexander or Sandy Roger. And it took him almost 3 years, but by January 1826, when the case was to be heard, Roger had managed to obtain precognitions from 63 witnesses. Now in court, the campaigners' case was put by a young advocate, William Penny, later Lord Kinloch, who began by pointing to the desirability of the riverside walk to the manufacturing population. Now, Harvie's defence was led by more experienced men, Henry Coburn, James Moncrieff. And Moncrieff started well, but later began unwittingly to betray the essence of Harvie's objections to opening the pathway at Westthorn. With the windows of Westthorn House only 400 yards from the river, Moncrieff protested that his client would be confronted by what Harvie called dissolute idlers, where he would have no choice but to observe from his windows naked bathers and other unseemly sights. Now, the campaigners' chief advocate was Francis Jeffrey, and Jeffrey spoke very eloquently and very passionately and wound up his address with the telling assertion that Harvie had bought Westthorn with his eyes open, or they should have been, and though it might suit mighty well for Harvie to talk of his establishment, and though the neighbourhood of the poor may to some delicate sensitivities be disagreeable, their privileges are neither to be despised nor trampled upon. And in the end, the jury voted unanimously for in the campaigners' favour. As the news of victory reached Glasgow, rejoicing broke out across the city. Fireworks were let off and bonfires lit, one of which was described as a pyramid of coals, the most tremendous ever seen in the city, while another was assembled and set alight right beside the offending Dyke. But the joy of the occasion was short-lived. Harvie lodged an appeal in the belief A, that he was right, and B, that with his financial resources, he would see off his less well-heeled opponents. He thought that money would win out. Now, I'm not going to take you through the next 3 years of legal wrangling. Suffice to say that Harvie even took his appeal to the House of Lords, but to no avail. The Lord Chancellor ruled that regardless of rank, even that of a monarch, roadways throughout the United Kingdom should remain freely accessible, provided there was proof that they had been open for 40 years. Glaswegians were exultant. The people had been triumphant, announced a broadsheet, headed the downfall of Harvie's Dyke. Huzzah, 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 it concluded, with steps being taken then, huzzah, huzzah, the liberty of the banks of the Clyde forever, it concluded. And steps were taken then to make openings in Harvie's walls. In sharp contrast, if you're interested in Thomas Harvie, he was a broken man. His demise had actually begun in 1823, Once it was known that he was determined to maintain his walls, the Glasgow public had boycotted his whisky shops and refused to buy coal from his colliery at Westthorn, which was then the second largest in Glasgow. His legal costs were cripplingly high. Even before going to the House of Lords, Harvie's debts were reputed to have stood at £60,000, which is well over £4 million today. In 1832, his Glasgow distillery company was sequestrated, and 2 years later, all his assets, including Westthorn estate, the mines and mansion house, were sold off. And in Glasgow itself, he became an object of ridicule. And not much more than 10 years later, Harvie was dead, having, it seems, suffered a stroke. He'd lived the last years of his life virtually alone in rented premises in Duke Street with few possessions and only the company, if you like, of a teenage carer or housekeeper who he may have married and who was living with him when he passed away. And there you may think our story ends. A moral tale, very Scottish, in that this was an instance of what was known then as a mushroom laird who got too big for his boots and forgot that we're all Jock Tamson's bairns. But the story, however, was far from over, as I'll explain as we now move towards the end of this talk. First, though, the victors. For them, this was a triumphant moment and hailed by such as the people of Glasgow. Within days of the Lord's ruling, a public meeting had been called to raise money for gold medals to be awarded to the campaign committee. A jubilant event, it featured an eclectic collection of readings that included extracts from Blackwood magazine and the Bible. Poems and songs were adapted or written for the occasion. If there was a common theme, it was that, like David, the people had taken on Goliath, otherwise Thomas Harvie, and David had won. Another trope was that, as with the once victorious Napoleon Bonaparte, it was anticipated that Harvie's once celebrated career would end in ignominy, and like Napoleon, his final resting place would be modest and unnoticed. So funds raised at this meeting, or at the meeting and subsequently, medals were designed by a William Warren, who was a local professor of art, and then struck by the highly esteemed engraver and medalist Thomas Wells Ingram, formerly of the Soho Mint in Birmingham. The medals, cast in bronze rather than gold as it happened, were powerfully symbolic. On one side was a figure of justice, protecting with a sword old Father Clyde. Beneath her feet lies the defeated figure of Thomas Harvie, who is depicted as rapacity or selfishness. While above, a herald holds a banner on which is inscribed the heroic motto, "Defend your rights," up in the right-hand corner there. On the reverse side were recorded the names of the campaign committee: Adam Ferry, George Rogers, James Duncan, John Watson, and John Whitehead. And the 5 men were thanked by the citizens of Glasgow for successfully defending the right to a path on the banks of the Clyde, 1829. But strangely, one name is missing from that list, and that's the radical poet, songwriter, and Harvie's Dyke activist, Sandy Roger, or Alexander Roger. Now, just why he was left out isn't clear, and I won't take time to speculate on this here. Yet Roger wasn't entirely neglected, nor his role overlooked. More than half a century later, in the 1890s, a complete edition of his works was published, in which he was credited by the admiring editor with being a principal, if not the chief instrument, in the battle with Thomas Harvie. Now, what this delayed recognition of Roger suggests is that public memory in the struggle over Harvie's Dyke lasted for much of the rest of the 19th century, and in some cases vividly so. A young lad from Bridgeton, whose name we don't know, reflected in 1864 that he'd lived through the campaign for parliamentary reform in 1832. He'd witnessed the great Chartist demonstrations in the 1830s and 1840s, and the fight in the same decade to repeal the Corn Laws. But never had he known anything, and I'm quoting here, as truly magnificent as that great opening of the banks of the Clyde. But despite all this, by the 20th century, and with everyone who had been around in the 1820s long deceased, the affair had more or less disappeared into the mists of time. But not quite, because a couple of the medals awarded in 1829 were displayed at the Scottish Exhibition of National History, Art and Industry held in Glasgow in 1911. But sometime thereafter were put in store, where they are still safely secured in Glasgow Museum's Resource Centre at Nitz Hill. Now, the last meaningful reference to the episode I could find was in 1933, almost a century ago, when a Glasgow journalist, James Cowan, on one of his walks through the city by the Clyde, came across the remains of Harvie's Dyke and registered mental thanks to the sturdy old citizens who had fought for the right I was now enjoying. But all this has been about memory. What of the legacy of the Harvie's Dyke episode? What, if any, was its lasting impact? Well, to begin with, the House of Lords ruling was for many years after 1828 considered to be an important legal milestone and appears as such in law textbooks. The definition of a rite of passage was clarified, and to cut a long legal story short, this remains the basis of what is understood as a public right-of-way today, and in Scotland there are some 7,000 of these, as I understand it. Secondly, and at first sight less positively, despite the Lord's ruling, owners of land in Scotland in the 19th century continued to block what were deemed to be public rights of way. Some still do, as we know. However, largely overlooked is the fact for many decades, whenever landed proprietors along the Clyde, or indeed anywhere else in Scotland, were tempted to block long-used walkways, time and time again the example of Harvie's Dyke campaigners was evoked. As late as 1884, as landlordism throughout Scotland became even more aggressive, the Glasgow Weekly Herald called on those affected to remember the Harvie's Dyke battles and take courage. And for many Scots, the writer of this piece went on, fresh air and public space were literally matters of life and death. And there are numerous other examples of this kind of thing, but I've only time for one. And this was in June 1891, when a public meeting of the inhabitants of Glasgow's East End villages, Carmyle, Baillieston and Shettleston, was called to protest about the felling of trees in the much-loved Kenwood forest, and against a stake and wire fence that had been put in along the path at Carmyle that ran high above the river. Now, this had so narrowed the path that pedestrians were obliged to walk in single file and were in danger of slipping off the edge. Now, during the speeches delivered at the 1,000-strong gathering, an unnamed man in the crowd called "Gie them Harvie's Dyke." Evidently fueled by drink, he followed his cry by demanding that cannons be obtained and the mansion house of the offending landowner be demolished. Now, while the more ambitious of his invocations were ignored, within 2 hours, not a vestige of what had been over 1.5 miles of fencing was left in place. So it's still influence inspired all those years later. Okay, so I'll now wind this up. Harvie's Dyke was, of course, far from being the only rights of way struggle in Scotland during the last 2 centuries. Even so, it was one of the most important. And why do I say that? Well, for one thing, and this deserves to be better known, the Harvie's Dyke campaign over a right of way as a public amenity was actually the first of its kind, not only in Scotland, but also the UK. And that, I think, is worth recognising. It's not in the history books, as I say, and perhaps it should be. The second point worth making is that what I hope has become clear is that reformers and radicals in industrialising Scotland were interested in more than the standard of living, the so-called bread and butter issues, and other matters historians have been fixated upon, like electoral politics and the Constitution and the rise of organised labour. On a day-to-day basis, being able to walk freely or simply meander and appreciate the sounds and sights of the natural world matters as much as the right to vote. If I had more time and was speaking to an audience solely of historians, I'd say more about this and how the Harvie's Dyke affair challenges what we think we know about radicalism in Scotland at the time. But that's for another day. What we can conclude here, though, is that the campaign for unfettered access along the banks of the River Clyde was an instance of environmental activism with a radical edge, instigated by the often overlooked ordinary folk of the eastern fringes of the industrialising city. The lead was then taken by the inhabitants of the older royal borough of Glasgow, who in their turn were deeply conscious of the town's history and their heritage and the importance of protecting the property rights of the people. So history matters. And it's because they acted on this that we are in a large part indebted for the existence of the 40-mile-long Clyde walkway that runs from Partick in the west to New Lanark in the east. On that walkway below Westthorn, unmarked and hard to spot, concealed behind wild-growing bushes, are part of what remains of Harvie's Great Dyke, a site perhaps which deserves to become a memorial of sorts, or what historians of memory call a lieu de mémoire. There we can, if we wish to wander along there, we may pay silent tribute to the Glaswegians who dared to take on Thomas Harvie, as well as their many successors who across Scotland have continued to defend public rights of way, and assured that along them we can breathe fresh air and celebrate nature in all of its many guises. We shouldn't, I think, forget them. If you'd like to know more, there's a book on all of this, which is actually out just now. But this is my primary reason for talking here. But meantime, I'd be happy to answer any questions during what I hope will be a lively discussion. Thank you very much for listening.
Chris, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. And can I ask Pete and Ingrid to come to the panel table as well? Now, we'll have a Q&A, but before we do, if I could just ask Ingrid and then Pete to introduce yourselves, that would be marvellous. Ingrid.
You want to go for it? Off you go. Okay. Hi, my name's Ingrid Shearer. I'm Heritage Engagement Manager for Glasgow Building Preservation Trust. I sometimes say I'm a recovering archaeologist. I don't think you ever really get over it. But I've worked in community heritage for sort of 20 plus years now. At the Trust, we repair and repurpose historic buildings. So over the last 30 years, oh no, actually what am I saying, 1982 was founded, that's 40 plus years. We've completed around about 30 capital projects. That's from like St Andrews in the Square to Kelvin Grove Bandstand. We've also recently been working on Govanhill Baths, which is historic baths in the Govanhill area and site of the longest community occupation of a civic building in Europe, I think. So yeah, nice tie in there with kind of protest and revolt. But most recently we completed the West Boathouse project, and I ran the kind of community engagement programme for that. So that was very much focused on the river and takes in the site of Harvie's Dyke as well. We took the geographic remit for that project from Glasgow Green right up to the Cunninger Loop, and really tried to kind of blend that cultural heritage, natural heritage, tangible, intangible, place-based and landscape-based approaches, and see it as a kind of whole. It is a river, so it made no sense to me to kind of tear these things apart. They're inextricably linked. And the East End is a part of the city that is really under-researched. So I'm really pleased to see Chris's book out and a little bit more of a spotlight on those communities. There's a huge appetite for heritage there and for people to tell their stories. And particularly, I think there's a lot more interest in the river now. So that's been really good to see through that project. Spent a lot of time talking to people about their perceptions and their feelings around about the river, and I think one of the things that really kind of drove the subsequent project, and the kind of messaging around that was some of those early questions, and understanding that for a lot of Glaswegians they had a very dysfunctional relationship with the river, and that had been kind of transmitted across generations. That was what really shocked me. I was expecting people to say, you know, come from the kind of nostalgia perspective and thinking about what they kind of lost in terms of shipbuilding and industry. What I wasn't expecting was to have young people kind of saying the same thing. So it was conversations with people who are coming from the kind of natural heritage perspective that really shifted my my thoughts on that and shaped the messages for that project, which was the idea that it was not just a living river, but a river in recovery. And that really resonated with people, I think, particularly through COVID. So the idea was to try and shift the dial a little bit in terms of those kind of attitudes towards the river and try and bring a bit of love back for it. So
Thank you. Thank you, Ingrid. That's beautifully put. And Pete?
Yes, first of all, thanks, Chris. I was in awe of what you were saying there. And I should have been focusing on what I was going to say next when I get to the microphone, but I didn't because I was so engaged with what you were saying. So I'm Pete Higgins. I'm a Professor of Outdoor Environmental and Sustainability Education at Edinburgh University. And what would I say about myself? Well, there's a CV, and the CV says I do a lot of different things. But essentially, I care about the land, the landscape, the seascape, and the peoples of Scotland. And I seek to educate in that sense, to be with students in that landscape and to help them to find their own ways of understanding, comprehending and developing a love of that landscape. So that's, if you like, the day job. I have had a lot of involvement in access issues over the years, and I'm not sure, Des, whether you want me to talk about this now or whether you're going to come back to us, but I can give you a little bit more reflection on Chris's talk. Is that the intention, that we just stop our introductions and then...
We'll take some questions, but we
just carry
absolutely
on.
want to hear.
Yeah.
Yep.
So if you don't mind, then here's a few reflections. So I can't add to Chris's stuff, but what I would say is, as you get older, you get more and more interested in history, and he's right. The history is so important in that sense. And history does matter. And I suppose I'll give you a few little anecdotes of things that relate to access for me. And they're all personal stories or reflections on things that I've experienced. So rather quickly now. So perhaps in some kind of order, I used to live very close to Glentillt near Pitlochry, and a colleague of mine, Fraser MacDonald, told me a story of John Hutton Balfour, who then was a professor of botany at Edinburgh University, and he was also the Regius Keeper at the Botanics, and he deliberately took his students in 1828 into Glentillt in confrontation with the Duke of Atholl. And this was about access. It was about saying, you can't stop us being here. And it's interesting when a person of that status then takes on somebody of that status. He, again, found himself in conflict, and the case went to the House of Lords, and that case was won by Balfour. Moving on, some years later, when I was a small boy, I suppose, well, young man, about the age of 17, I had the privilege of paddling down the River Spey on my own in a kayak that I'd made myself. That's a pretty unusual thing to do all those years ago. A few years later, I discovered that a man called Clyde Freshwater had been taken to court by Wills, the family that owned Nakando area, an estate on the Spey, for infringing what they considered to be their rights to preclude people from being on that river and impacting on their fishing. I was a salmon biologist in the past, so I have some interest in that. Again, this went to the House of Lords, and Freshwater won. So another success, really. More contemporaneously, I might talk about the fact that I take my students to Arthur's Seat, and I now am unable to take them to Hutton's section to show them this important site, because it was closed in 2018, just about 200 years after Thomas Harvie's Dyke example. So how is that? How can that be? And how are the people of Edinburgh not rising up as they did then? And I've been inciting my students to riot, but don't tell anybody. And it is outrageous. They can never open that again because the argument is that there's a public danger. Once you say there's a public danger, you have to do something about it in order to make it possible for people to access that site. And finally, I'll come to the Land Reform 2003 Act, which I was quite involved in different ways with regard to ownership issues, but also with regard to access. And a wonderful man called Alan Blackshaw, whose work is not widely known, was trained as a lawyer, but also was a mountaineer. He wrote for the Scottish Law Review a paper describing the customary traditions of access. Now, people refer to the right to roam. I like to use customary traditions of access because Alan points out that this stream of history going right back to before Harvie's Dyke, right through, emphasizes the way in which it was hospitality. It's not even hospitality to allow people on your land. It is just what you do. You don't even think about it. People can come through your land. They historically could come to your house. And you would not have thought about this as being anything that you were giving, any implied consent. It was just what you did, what you were, what people were. And to me, the challenges that we now see, and they are increasing with regard to access to the countryside, we need to be mindful of those and to say, as Alan said back in 1999, this is the high watermark. We now have enshrined in law customary traditions of access, which if we are not careful, we will lose. And so we need to make sure we're mindful and we need to take on those challenges where they arise. Thank you, Des.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Pete. So, questions, thoughts, and various hands are going up. Yes, first. I'll just get you a microphone just to help you.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you. I'd like to respond to the last comment, if I may, about Hutton's section. The people of Edinburgh have been rising up. Yeah. The Edinburgh Geological Society, the Ramblers Association, and no doubt many more, have been campaigning for several years now to get that reopened. The point has been made again and again that actually for safety reasons, Hutton's section itself is perfectly safe. Yeah. And a barricade, if there has to be one for safety reasons, could be much further back and it could leave that very important exposure for students and members of the public to enjoy and to learn from. So I'm completely with you there.
Thank you, and I'm aware of all that through Angus Miller and others as well.
Indeed, yeah.
But it's the whole road that needs to be opened up. Yeah. And the irony is, of course, that people cross busy roads to get to the radical road, and they're in much greater danger crossing those busy roads to get to the radical road. But thank you.
Such is health and safety.
Great stuff. All strength to you. Someone at the back? Yes, please.
Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks very much for showing the medal with this little drill hole, which shows that someone had worn it on a lapel. But I've got a broader question. If the people of Glasgow own a pathway taking you past the site of the Dyke, who owns the River Clyde?
No pressure.
There's been a lot of discussion around that question over the last sort of year. And I know Jude Barber and Louise Welsh are currently delivering a lot of kind of lectures and talks and workshops around about that theme, and they've involved Andy Whiteman in that process as well. So he's kind of gently pushing for the Clyde to have a kind of legal personage. I don't know if you've heard about that or what you're... I have kind of mixed feelings about it, to be honest, but complex, I would say. Peel Ports own a large chunk of riverbank. Obviously, the Crown Estate owns the riverbed, and that will be right up as far as Cambuslang because it's tidal up until that point. The tidal weir creates a kind of artificial barrier, but it is strictly tidal right up that far. And then the rest is a bit of a guddle, to be honest. It's complex.
In the time I'm talking about, these individual estate proprietors had rights. Their estates ran down to the river itself. So I don't know if that's probably a complicating factor, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
And because some of those rights, I guess, will still be maintained.
Yeah, and it is very complex. I think there's going to be a lot of untangling to be done there.
Just in terms of river ownership, generally, of course, you're probably aware that there's riparian ownership, and riparian ownership can be different, both banks, but also I can think of situations where one person owns one bank, another person owns the other bank, and two different people own the bed to the middle. Now, it's loopy, but actually, if you're interested in the water, then of course, it starts from somewhere else. So if you start arguing about who owns the water, it's like arguing about where the air comes from that we breathe. So that's where some of this stuff with Andy and others does have a basis, which is to say, if we give it a personhood status, then we can protect that. And there are contemporary examples of that in other countries, of course. So,
Great, we've got another question. Yes, Kate, just down here. Sorry, thanks, Becky.
This is a historian's question, but anybody can answer it. Chris, would you like to reflect further on what your tale tells us about folk memory and how it's maintained? How did the chap who said Gielam Harvie's Dyke know to say that?
Yeah, well, I think, from what I can gather, in this instance, the memory, if you like, lives on through individuals telling this tale to their children and possibly to their grandchildren. But I think, and also the newspapers of the time use the image, if you like, as an inspiration or something as a basis for discussion about what was going on later. But most of the memory of this is lost by the time that those people who were around at the time, or maybe their children, had died. So the memory, there's very little memory left by the turn of the 20th century, and it's only occasional individuals who maybe are antiquarians, who, and I say this with society, who seem to be conscious of the fact that this thing had taken place. But what not troubles me, but what has surprised me is that we historians have missed this, because it was a big story at the time, and it continues to be a big newspaper story right through to the 1890s anyway, and yet we've missed it, and I think there are all sorts of reasons for that, which I won't necessarily go into, but one of them is as kind of said in the talk, that we have become fixated by the radical war of 1820. Now, let me tell you, this is I didn't include earlier. The radical war, as many people will know, happened in 1820. It was a rising of radicals in April 1820. It didn't last long. Those people involved were either escaped, or they were arrested and executed or transported. But most of the books, I would say 70% of what I've read about the radical war, and I read a fair bit, they end in 1820. It's as if then, in terms of radicalism in Scotland, it appears again in 1832 with the campaign for the ballot. Or for the Reform Act of 1832, and what's in between is missing. Well, Harvie's Dyke is one of the things that's missing, because some of the individuals who were from places like Parkhead in 1820, either they left immediately after 1820, but they had returned, and so there's four of my characters who are involved in my tale, who were involved in the radical war. But their radicalism in this instance was not concerned with the ballot or parliamentary reform. It was concerned with the notion of liberty and the liberty to walk in ways that they thought were theirs. That is they wanted to walk along what they consider to be the people's property. So I'm havering a wee bit, but what I'm trying to say is that we have that it has not been written down as often as it merits, I think, and so therefore we have missed it, if you like, because of the not obsession, I won't say that, but with the enthusiasm that historian colleagues, past and present, have for 1820 itself, and a very restricted view of what radicalism is. So, yeah.
Chris, we've got some questions online, and then I'm going to come to a colleague here. But can I just ask you quickly, Chris, how important are the newspapers of the day as good source material?
Well, like all source material, you've got to be careful with it and know who the editor of the newspaper is and check out the validity of the writer. But they're hugely useful. In fact, I doubt if I could have done this bit of research. I mean, I've used a lot of legal papers for this, but I doubt if I could have done what I've done in terms of looking for the repercussions or resonances of Harvie's Dyke afterwards without online newspapers, because how would I have looked at all of the Scottish newspapers for 80, 90 years? So the keyword search has been absolutely crucial.
Great, thank you, Chris. Kate?
Yes, thanks, Des. There's a couple of just comments which I'll read out first and then a question. So the first one from BC Cletts was just stating that in almost every city with a navigable waterway, there is a riparian right of public access along the navigation. And until the 1950s, we had a 15-foot wide corridor right through Glasgow. And they were saying that, sadly, in the 1950s, Glasgow Council revoked this detail and allowed developments to close off the riverbanks. For example, the casino at King George V Bridge. Alison Miranda sort of suggesting that she's angry at the National Trust for Scotland for shutting off access to buildings, particularly those such as Hales Castle and Tantallon Castle. And then finally, the question from Christina is asking, how does Chris and the panel think that Harvie's Dyke episode compares in its significance with more well-known historical events like the radical rising of 1820?
Great question. Chris?
I could answer the last one by saying, I think in many respects this is more important. This captured the radical, during the Radical War there was great support for it, but it wasn't universal support of the sort you had in the 1820s for this occasion. And in fact, these characters, my campaigners, won. The Radical War, you could argue the campaign is still going on but let me not go down that road. Let me just say that I think it's certainly on a par with the Radical War in terms of its significance, in terms of the involvement, in terms of the enthusiasm, in terms of the issue in some ways, which, as I said in my talk, was about the right to roam, if you like, the right to breathe fresh air, the right to have access to nature, the right of people to exercise rights or to walk on walkways that they had walked on for probably centuries. So, yeah.
Ingrid or Pete, do you want to reflect on that?
No, I don't think I've got anything to add to that.
That's great. Yeah. Great. Got a hand here and then a hand behind. Yes.
Thanks very much, Chris. Really, really enjoyable talk. I was just wondering what the balance in all of this is between proactive support at the time for a right-of-way as against proactive animus against the individual, Harvie. Would it have made a difference if there had been a different landlord, i.e. somebody not involved in the nefarious drink trade, corrupting the morals of the people? Would it have made a difference if he had been old money rather than new money? I think of those huge domain walls that still to this day surround ducal estates across Scotland. So let me pitch that at you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think old versus new money would have been a factor, didn't matter, because others who were old money had been building the dikes which were blocking the walkway, and they were attacked, if you like, in the 18th century and indeed in the early 19th century too. So, but where that might matter is that Harvie's rise was so rapid, and he, if you like, shoved his newfound riches in the faces of ordinary people, rode around Glasgow in a carriage followed by a young lad on a horse, this kind of thing, really showing off, if you like. And I think that was built a sense of resentment. But where I think to go back to the first point you made, I think there was massive support for the opening of the walkway. Popular support across the board. However, I think an element in the animus of the coal miners was that Harvie had bought his estate in Westthorn. He had got involved in industrial, let's call them industrial relations disputes, wage cutting, just after he took over the estate. And I think there's one contemporary account, I can't remember where it is right now, where it's from, but there is one campaign which said that if the coal miners had their way, they'd have lynched Harvie. So it's a factor. It might have added a bit of dig, if you like, and it might explain why the coal miners were at the head of the march, but it wasn't a coal miner who, we don't know exactly who paid Thomas Fraser 2 and 6pence or half a crown to read out this announcement or proclamation. But there's a wonderful woman in this story which I haven't talked about. She's his wife, who was interrogated 3 or 4 times because she'd accepted the money on her husband's behalf, and she wouldn't betray the identity of the individual other than say he was a weaver. So this is a community-based protest, if you like, which attracted to the inhabitants of the old town of Glasgow, who were wont to walk along the banks of the Clyde. But there is, yes, there are local factors too. Yeah.
Fantastic question. There's a yes question there, and then to you, sir. So, lady first. I was going to say lady in the...
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk. This is actually a dispute that I've studied from a different perspective, which is the legal perspective, because I work on legal access to customary legal access to land. And I'm curious what you think, whether the fact that there is a very involved legal dispute is whether that's part of it being buried as a social protest dispute, whether the fact that there are lots of long and very complicated legal papers, whether that's affected the sort of historiographical aspect of it. Because you were asking about the newspaper, actually, Henry Coburn brought together both the legal papers and the newspaper reports in a publication, and in fact inscribed the first copy of this, which sits down in the British Library in London, which is where I found it.
Chris, or
the answer is, it's a good question, actually, which I haven't thought about, but I think, but yes, these legal cases, you know, are voluminous, and I hope there's no lawyers in the audience. It's very dull as well and repetitive, because the same evidence is repeated time and time again. But anyway, but the thing is that these cases were being watched. As you can see from what I was saying about the way that there's jubilation on the streets when they thought they'd won at the Court of Session. The same thing happens after the Lord ruling. You know, there's as I showed the picture of the broadsheet, which was published almost within hours of the news coming from London that the folks that the campaign had been successful. So I'm pretty sure that most people weren't following laboriously the legal processes, but they certainly were interested in the outcomes.
That's where the newspapers are so important in bringing these to the attention of people. Peter Ingrid.
Can I just add, I think that's fairly symptomatic of the East End in general just being overlooked, ignored. There's been very little attention given to that area. I sat on a University of Glasgow conference over COVID, and somebody said that there was nothing of note above the weir for the historian, and resisted tipping the table, but
Deary me, yes, Pete.
Just I loved your question, and just a wee kind of reflection, which is, it's many people have said this, but of course The people who wrote the ownership charters were educated people, and often they were written in Latin. And of course, that was not accessible to the common people. And so, you know, to a large degree, you just say, I own this land, you write it, and on you go. And, you know, there have been a number of really interesting issues arising as a result of that. The ownership of the Cuillin on Skye being a really good, relatively recent example. Did MacLeod and MacLeod actually own the land? And again, it was Alan Blackshaw and Andy Whiteman who started to challenge that by going into historical documents and translating. So these assertion of claim of ownership is easy if you've got the power. And one of the things, just as a PS, that I find quite ironic in a way is that it's the House of Lords that has confirmed, in a positive way, the access claims that we're talking about here, when indeed most of those people were landowners historically, and in England, where the laws of access are very different. In fact, very, very different, which of course you know. But just a small observation. Thank you.
Mm. Just to the point that you're making about legal processes, if you like, and I, ironically, my first introduction to the Harvie's Dyke case was through a legal case, because when I was working 25 years ago on protest in Scotland during the Industrial Revolution, basically, I came across this case, because I was looking at Court of Session cases basically about strikes and riots and disorder and all this, and I came across this one, but I didn't understand it really because it didn't fit with what I was looking for, which was protests about owners cutting wages and all that kind of stuff. But it nagged me, and that was about 1998 I saw it first of all, and it's been nagging me for 20 years plus, and about 3 or 4 years later I thought I need to do something with this, and so I talked with Hugh Andrew, and we decided there was a story here to be told. So legal. I didn't get it first from the newspapers. It was the newspapers there. I don't think they had online newspapers when I began this.
Well, that's Hugh being inspired as ever. Actually, one of our finest publishers. Yes, question. And then we are drawing to a close.
I'm not sure if it's a question or a suggestion. I knew hardly any of this, so it's been really interesting. But I went on a cruise on the Tyne, where I heard all this sort of information on a ship, and a very learned person told me about the history of the river and the shipbuilding, and we got up to Admiral Collingwood. Can I do that on the Clyde? Because a lot more people would be interested if they were sat on a ship. And we talk about the rights on the banks, but the rights on the river. Can you do a Clyde cruise with this sort of information?
You could, theoretically. There's sort of ribs take people up and down, but it's not really a very relaxing kind of format for your, historian overboard.
This was on a sort of May the 4th type ship.
There's a weir that's the issue there. If you wanted to get up beyond Glasgow Green, you can get over it in a boat. I've done it, but but you need to wait till the tide's right, and they will lower the gates for you to get over. I did try to persuade the rowing clubs that I was working with that maybe they could start doing, road tours, but unless they would just race.
This was a boat hired by the Northumbrian Cambridge Association that they provided the lecture, so somebody could hire a boat, no doubt.
Yeah,
your second career actually.
Yeah, well, yeah, you would need to take the weir out though, and that would then the water levels drop, and there's. Yeah, you could.
Oh, great. Kate, any more online?
No, nothing in terms of comments.
Well, I think we'll draw proceedings. Yeah, well, it's absolutely brilliant, actually. Just final question from me for you all, really, and that's just in terms of the impact of this story on you. What has struck you most vividly? I'll come to you last, Chris, if I may. But Ingrid, in terms of hearing this story and becoming familiar with it, and I agree with you absolutely, this should be much more widely publicised.
Yeah, I'm so pleased that it's getting the attention that it deserves, because it is quite well known in the East End, but not to the depth that you know, Chris's research has gone. So it's really great, and I think I'll be pushing the local schools to get a copy in there. And also, I did forget to mention that we also run Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival, and always on the hunt for speakers. I could see that going down really well. Yeah, I mean, it's part of a tradition, and particularly when it comes to the river, because that's kind of my love and focus, and anything that kind of brings that back to the river and rights to the banks, to the water, is really important in terms of kind of shifting. I can't overemphasize those responses that I got back from people, and I asked them 2 really simple questions right the way through that 4-year period, any kind of groups that we worked with or individuals that I spoke to. And the first question was, maybe ask you guys, fairly simple, associative, what do you think of when you think of the River Clyde? And you get the kind of expected responses, shipbuilding or, you know, the crane or whatever. And then, what do you feel when you think of the River Clyde? And that was the one that really kind of got in under the skin. That was where you got shame, failure, and that kind of disenfranchisement that was really sad. But I think actually it's really starting to shift now, and stories like that are really, really important. And just giving people a sense of hope that they can change things. Yeah. They can make a difference as individuals, because we need reminded of that now more than ever, I think.
I think it would make a terrific school play, by the way, the story. So think about that.
You want to play Thomas Harvie?
No, the headmaster can do that. Pete.
Well, as always, when I hear somebody with enormous competence speak, I kind of feel envious and in awe. So that's one feeling. I suppose the next is that there's stuff here that I need to be able to build into the narrative that I tell when I'm trying to encourage people to think about and care about access to the land and the sea, and to rivers. And just in passing, I was talking earlier about the impact of fish cages. I'm a salmon biologist, as I said, salmon farming on our sense of remoteness of the west coast of Scotland, and in particular the difficulties of access around sea cages or cages of salmon in these areas when you're a sea kayaker or you're a sailor. So there are infringements on access taking place now in that way. My final point is something that comes to me quite often, and this did actually happen to me. Because I knew this particular millionaire, but some of you may know Norman McCaig's poem, A Man in Assynt, and he says, who owns this landscape, the man who bought it, the millionaire who bought it, or I who am possessed by it? And I can remember having a confrontation with the millionaire who owned Assynt. I was actually taking salmon away to the River Thames at the time, but that's another story. So that's how it makes me feel. It reminds me of that relationship about notions of ownership, of place and care and love.
Great.
Thank you, Des.
Thank you, Pete. And Chris, finally, you know, as a historian and a writer, what's been the overriding impact of this on you?
It's difficult. I enjoy writing, actually, and I hope that comes across if anyone reads the book. And I was able to write it in a different way than I have been taught as a so-called academic. That it's written as a kind of novel. It's written in a... There's a chapter at the end which gets into the historiography and significance and all of that. But so it's been a pleasure, a joy actually, to find out something and write a story, because it's his story I'm in the business of. But you know, in terms of, I like the fact what I've enjoyed academically is the way that I'm kind of thinking again about radicalism in the early 19th century and what it meant, and I think widening out the concept. But you know, as Ingrid was saying, I think the take-home lesson for me is a huge admiration for people who stood up to be counted on the matter of principle, and you know, carried on for 4, 5, 6 years in order to win their way. And you're right. You know, we need more of that. People need to feel empowered. And in fact, even in the later 19th century, people were, one of the Glasgow newspapers, I think it was, or it might, I can't remember if it was Glasgow, one of the newspapers anyway, made the point that have we lost that passion which the Harvie's Dyke campaigners had, you know, when this writer was writing about, or journalist was writing about some other protest that was taking place. Perhaps it might have been the Glen Tilt thing, actually. But yeah, so yes, people have power to resist.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah,
brilliant.
so,
And I love this term, Clyde, the river of recovery. It's fantastic.
I think we've kind of forgotten how to protest.
Well,
Time to reclaim that.
that may come into its own. So, thank you so much. A couple of thank yous from me. Ingrid and Pete, thank you so much for being excellent panellists. Thank you to all of you and to those of you online for being here and for participating in the discussion. Thank you to the Society of Antiquarians for hosting this with the Royal Society of Edinburgh, your younger kin. Thank you to Becky, Kate and colleagues for putting on the show and for looking after us. It's great work. And thank you, Chris. Thank you. It's wonderful. Please join me in thanking everyone. Thank you very much, everyone. And we'll now adjourn upstairs, I think, for some food. Oh, through there. Brilliant. Thank you.